Good afternoon and welcome to the 19th edition of Art Toronto. I'm Susanna Rosenstock, the director of the fair. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. I'm happy to welcome you today to Focus California All Weather, 3 projects in the California landscape. This talk is a complement to the Focus California exhibition, Indoor-Outdoor, that is in the center of the fair, featuring work by 18 California-based artists, and to our very exciting group of galleries in the Focus California section that's just outside of the stage area here. These galleries are all from Los Angeles and San Francisco, and many are here in Toronto for the first time, so I encourage you, if you haven't already, to go visit them after the talk. Focus California is curated by Kim Nguyen, curator and head of programs at the CCA Wadis Institute in San Francisco, and Glen Helfand, the moderator of today's talk, who is a writer, critic, curator, and educator based in Oakland, California. Please join me in welcoming Glen Helfand, who will introduce the other speakers.
Thank you, Susanna. It's been a thrill to be here and to be able to work on this project. So and I'm presuming most of you have seen the show. If not, hopefully this will give you a little bit of context, or you can go back. We were asked to curate an exhibition about California and to work with galleries from California. And it was interesting to realize how difficult it is to encapsulate a region as vast as that state. We ended up utilizing the notion of landscape as a way to reflect the diversity of the population and the artistic sensibilities that are in that landscape. There were a couple of pieces we were guided by to inspire us at the beginning. One was the Janet Delaney photograph, which said, the 1982 photograph that says, "We're changing San Francisco." And Rick Prelinger, whose Lost Landscapes of Los Angeles and San Francisco are flanking the exhibition on the 2 monitors. Those are compiled found footage about location. These show the changing face of these very different cities through views on the ground. For this panel, rather than trying to corral a broad conversation on the state, we decided to offer 3 views that are also from the ground. 2 artists and 1 curator who are working on projects there in California. They're rooted in Northern and Southern California, as well as the low desert of Coachella Valley. We'll have each of them do a short presentation, and then that'll be followed by group discussion and hopefully some comments from you. So I'll introduce each of them in the order in which they will appear. First is Karla Wozniak, who received her BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design and her MFA from the Yale School of Art. Recent solo exhibitions include Schneider Museum in Ashland, Oregon, and Gregory Lynn Gallery in San Francisco, which has a booth right around the corner. Recent group exhibitions include Currents, Knoxville Museum of Art, Knoxville, Tennessee, 6 at Regina Rex in New York, Fortune Teller Chatter at Bard College, at Simon's Rock. Her work is included at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and the Knoxville Museum of Art Permanent Collections. She's a native of Berkeley, California, and is currently assistant professor at California College of the Arts in San Francisco, and a colleague of mine. Suné Woods is an artist living in Los Angeles. Her work takes the form of video installations, photographs, and collage that examine absences and vulnerabilities within cultural and social histories. And there's some of her work literally right around the corner there at Casemore Kirkby. She has participated in residencies at Headland Center for the Arts, Vermont Studio Center, the Center for Photography at Woodstock, and Lightwork. Her work was recently included in Made in LA 2018 at the Hammer Museum. She has served as visiting faculty in the CalArts Photography and Media Program, Vermont College of Fine Arts Visual Art Program, and is currently visiting lecturer in the Department of Visual Environmental Studies at Harvard. And she just came up from there for this. And then finally, Matthew Schum is a writer based in Los Angeles and is co-curator with Amanda Hunt of Desert X 2019. He's taught art history at the University of California, San Diego, the Willem de Kooning Academy, Otis College of Art, NYU Steinhardt, Cal State Bakersfield, and is currently a lecturer at Cal State Long Beach. He's done exhibitions at MoMA and work on exhibitions at MoMA, Walker Art Center, Vancouver Art Gallery. From 2012 to 2015, he served as curator at LAX Art. And in 2015, Schum initiated a series of exhibitions scaling the colonial interior of the U.S. along the Mississippi River entitled The Mississippian with Y's instead of I's, and also went to school in Vancouver. So I'm going to turn the mic and the screen over to Karla.
Okay, thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to talk about sort of two bodies of work I've made in the last 4 years. I moved back to California after living on the East Coast and then in Tennessee for almost 20 years. So I've recently returned to the state. And I'm originally, like Glen said, originally from Berkeley. And my work has dealt with landscape in a variety of ways pretty consistently over my times making paintings. So it's something that I keep coming back to. And I'm also always been really influenced from, in more or less direct ways from where I'm living and where I'm at. I want to talk a little bit about just very briefly about some of my influences, because even though in a lot of ways, I'm sort of recently back in California, I feel like I was very much reared on California art and sort of the landscape of California art, and particularly the Bay Area. My parents were in Berkeley in the 60s. They met at UC Berkeley. They were met at like a left political campaign. So I kind of grew up with the mythology of the 60s in a lot of ways. But also kind of the aesthetics of the 60s were all around us. Like I'd hang out on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, which people may know of, which has like, you can buy tie-dye t-shirts on the street. And I don't know, it's just sort of like in the air there. And I think that some of that energy really kind of comes into my work now. It's kind of like seeped into it in terms of like vibration and color and intensity. And then I was also really reared on the Bay Area figurative painters and a lot of like 20th century California painters, which there was a really wonderful tradition in the Bay Area. So artists like Richard Diebenkorn, among others, where like the sense of light and color that is really, I think, connected to the state and the sort of aesthetics of Northern California. But also this relationship of abstraction and representation and the kind of buzz when something is like both at the same time. So it's not an either or situation, but like a sort of happening at once. And then this is the last artist that I'll show, which is Jess Collins, who a really interesting Bay Area artist, made a lot of paintings and collages. I really love a lot of the work, but really been very directly influenced by a lot of his paintings, which are both like graphic, but also very tactile, thick, kind of chunky and weird, but also like very chromatic in sort of strange ways. And also the sort of like mysticism quality of the work that also I think really relates to like the subcultures of the Bay Area in the 20th century and I guess now too. So anyway, I'm going to show you some work starting from around 2015 when I moved back to California. I started to make landscape paintings once I was settled. And, I'd been working in a certain way when I was in Tennessee, but moving to California, I really had to like shift gears of how I was thinking about making, and I really wanted to sort of reflect where I was at. And I was thinking a lot about the Sierra Nevada and also like other parts of California landscape. I did a lot of work based on like succulents in the desert, and just thinking about the sort of extremeness of the California landscape. The geology is new, things are moving, things are changing, earthquakes are happening, but also just sort of the intensity of it, like the intensity of the beauty, but also kind of like, I mean, I moved back in 2015. It was like right in the middle of that insane drought we were having. And I was like, man, this place is really kind of, there's also like a scariness to it. Like there's like a danger in it. There's fires, there's drought, there's like a sort of instability in the landscape that I was sort of thinking about with these pieces. So they're on one hand like very celebratory, but also thinking about some of those issues. They're very tactile and built up, and I was thinking a lot about patterning, textiles, weaving. Here's another smaller one. Thinking about also like how I could use color to, I mean, on one hand, there's sort of the like otherworldliness of the color, but also maybe kind of a toxicity embedded in sort of how like, into the pictures in a way. And here's another large one. This is, I was thinking about, like sort of geology, seismic shifts, but also like sort of a fantastical, sort of sci-fi like quality, just slightly. And I think, again, the sort of like, I think when I think about the California landscape, I mean, I grew up not a religious person and surrounded by a lot of, people who are very interested in Buddhism and like different kinds of sort of, Eastern, like shamanistic, whatever, the whole thing that we're into out in the West. And I sort of feel like thinking about the landscape as a place for like visions or, experiences, that maybe there's something of that in these paintings. So I made this group of work, and then, in this spring of 2017, I shifted gears. I had a child right before I moved to California. So I had a small kid, and I was feeling a little distanced from my practice. I realized that my work had always been about exploring, being outside. The paintings were all based loosely on specific places that I would visit, photograph, draw. And that just really wasn't what was going on in my life. Like, my life had become much more domestic. I was figuring out what it was to juggle being an artist, being a parent, having a new job. And I felt like part of my life was like really not in my work, and I was trying to sort of struggle to sort of figure out how these things all mesh together. And I just started doodling, and I just started to draw just from my head, like the stuff in my immediate environment. And that was like stuff that had to do with parenting, because I don't know if for the parents out there, the sort of explosion of things that are necessary or not necessary, but maybe you have to deal with a young child. Like all of a sudden your life is like populated with all these objects, all these things. So I've started to think about, sort of shifting gears and trying to like make these paintings that were more about domestic spaces, more about my home, more about something that was like a really direct experience. Here's another one. I was thinking about these, like I liked the sort of toys because they could kind of animate the space. And I was also started really thinking about the window as a motif, because it was a way to have a painting, but also landscape, within like the sort of frame within a frame. And also just thinking a lot about like the mundaneness of having a small kid, but also like how overwhelming and fascinating it is, and the sort of like trance almost that maybe it can induce at times. So anyway, that was kind of some of the things I was thinking about it. These also are really, again, like the way I painted hadn't really changed dramatically. Like they were very tactile. Some of the paint is very thick. Some of it is like very, very, very thin, lots of like areas that are repainted, kind of like frames within frames in terms of how the paintings are set up. Here's another one. I was again thinking a lot about textiles and like the rug or blanket as a place to play and to actually kind of make an abstract geometric painting within a painting without making it just an abstract geometric painting. And I think these maybe in terms of landscape in California, I don't know. There's still the light, the color. I don't know. There's something that still feels very West Coast to me about these. I started to think about my patio and that as a landscape, because I was still interested in making these sort of figural plant forms. This is a large one. So yeah, just kind of like trying to see what I could fit into one painting, I guess, in this one. Here's a detail. And then also still life, really like the idea of, playing around with these objects, and also just like the surrealism that could come into it with these toys. Like all of a sudden there's this like lion character in this painting and something's happening. At the same time, it's just like stuff on a table, which I became really interested in. This is in the show. So yeah, another still life. Toy cars are really interesting. One thing that's really I've been fascinated with watching my daughter is the way that she animates things that just look like junk to us. Like all of a sudden, like, a car becomes this whole world. And maybe not what you think it is. Like maybe it's like, that's just the imagination is just so incredible. So anyway, lots of cool little toy cars. I just have a few more here. This is a patio painting. I don't know, again, like sort of the surrealism that can come in with the characters. I was thinking about Curator actually with this painting, which is where the title is from a Curator painting. But the idea of these sort of like weird still life motifs out in the landscape. And then I made a couple of these window paintings, which led to the work that's actually up in Gregory Lynn's booth. And I got really interested in the window as like both a portal, a frame, like, something that talks about painting has a window into, of its own into sort of a different world. But also for me, kind of about like longing, being inside, thinking about outside, domestic, exterior life. Here's another one. So yeah, thinking about also like sort of being in a more suburban world and like locating myself there. And then sort of the window as like a reflection in a way. Like this one has this like silhouette up in the top, which is like a little, it's subtle, but it's like a little family. And then this is the last of these paintings that I'll show you that, this was from a show that I had last spring at Gregory Lynn, and I wanted to put my daughter in the show. I mean, the show was really about me more than her in a lot of ways, but I wanted to like hide her in the show, so this is her like peeking out. It's an installation. And then I'm not going to really talk about these because you can go see them, but I have a series of newer works that I made in the last couple months, which I kind of think of like as like maybe sort of a gelling of these two body of works in a way, which play along with the window motif. This is a detail. Here's another one. So still like interior, exterior, kind of this little sink painting. Sort of something like magical happening outside, but you're inside. And yeah, suburban vision mountain painting. So anyway, this is the detail. So that's it. Thank you. Do I just close this? No. Okay, great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Karla and I had like a brief conversation right before this began, and she said that this space reminded her of a jumpy house. So I'm going to conceptualize all of us being in the jumpy house together. So feel free to take off your shoes and get comfortable. So So I'd like to begin with a quote by Octavia E. Butler, who I've been quite influenced by reading Parable of the Sowers now with my students. So I'll read this. There seem to be solid biological reasons why we are the way we are. If there weren't, the cycles wouldn't keep replaying. The human species is a kind of animal, of course, but we can do something no other animal species has ever had the option to do. We can choose. We can go on building and destroying until we either destroy ourselves or destroy the ability of our world to sustain us, or we can make. This is a still from a short video piece I did called Feeling Like Chaos in 2015. utilizing the California landscape. And it's part of a larger frame of work that I call To Sleep with Terra. And in this work in particular, I'm thinking about what it means to have intimacy during times of chaos or through chaos. And I guess what I consider chaos is state violence, environmental disasters, psychological warfare. And you can play this, and I'll talk over it a little bit. So, when I was in 2015, when I was making that work and thinking through the ideas for To Sleep with Terra, I was also living in Los Angeles, and we were about 4 years into one of the worst droughts in the history of California. So this also influenced kind of my thinking about, bodies with water, without water, our water sustainability, how we think about water, like how we buy water. You can actually stop it there. That's fine. And in To Sleep with Terra was also making collages. This is a large-scale piece, about 4 feet by 5 feet, or I believe like 1 meters by 1.5 meters. And there's another piece, as Glen mentioned, right behind us with Casemore Kirkby that was in this same body of work. But I was thinking about how, I was really interested in working with materials that already existed. So this is made of magazine pages, primarily images of landscapes from magazines, where these magazines kind of portrayed this ideal beauty of a space that without kind of any context of like who lives in that landscape. And we're going to revisit Octavia Butler again. I'll read this as well. You are hierarchical. That's the older and more entrenched characteristic. We saw it in your closet, closest animal relatives, and in your most distant ones. It's a terrestrial characteristic. When human intelligence served it instead of guiding it, when human intelligence did not even acknowledge it as a problem, but took pride in it or did not notice it at all, that was like ignoring cancer. And this is part of the kind of same time period in 2015 where I was utilizing collage to think about, kind of this relationship we have in this country to imperialistic mechanisms, structures of power, and how to think through those histories. This initially is an image by Marion Post Wolcott, who was a Farm Security Administration photographer, and that was a governmental organization that hired photographers to document what was going on in the time, so extreme poverty during the Great Depression. And I'll let you all read this one on your own. But this is leading into kind of my work with water, which started in 2015 and then continued with a project that I'm going to share with you called Aragonite Stars. And so in thinking about water, there's, of course, a very complicated history of African Americans or Black folks who engage with water, beaches that were segregated, pools that were segregated, and more recently, the young woman, Dejaria, who was at a pool in Texas and was thrown to the ground by a police officer and sat on top of. So I'm interested in, this kind of a legacy of forced and voluntary migration, but also a legacy of violence in water, but also moving towards how can we think of water as kind of like an environment, like a landscape where I can invoke my own mythologies and use it as a space for healing. And this is a still from The Escapists, also in 2015. And so it was the beginning of my thinking about Black folks in water, utilizing, I guess I wouldn't say they're necessarily performers, but people who I asked to perform, or to work with me in these spaces in water. So this is obviously a pool. It was a lap pool, but I wanted to use a space where I could kind of have a controlled environment and it be more of a contemplative space. And this is when I started the project Aragonite Stars in 2018, and it was a project that I did for Made in LA at the Hammer Museum. Moving through the different kind of environments in Los Angeles, utilizing hot springs was very important to me. So this was a quote that I discovered at Two Bunch of Palms, which is a hot spring in Southern California. And I'm going to share, this is a clip of the installation called Aragonite Stars. It was a 5-channel video installation. Most of the footage was either shot by me or I found online. And I was visiting hot springs. I was also going in tide pool locations, and was also thinking about the Pacific Ocean. So it's about, I believe this clip is about 5 minutes, so can you play it? We have to back up. So much better on this like little screen in front of us than on this what you're seeing. But I was thinking about the relationship between we who call ourselves humans and other species, and that interconnectedness, and also thinking of water as this space. A lot of cultures think about the ocean in particular as an underworld where ancestors reside. So as tapping into some of those mythologies, thinking about how water is revered and understood, but also thinking about how we are also exploiting it as a resource. And the entire piece is about 7 minutes, 5 seconds. And it was important for me to create kind of an immersive space that wasn't necessarily like inside kind of a black box, but I wanted people to kind of experience what it felt like with the sounds and feel. I guess it felt more like you were kind of in an aquarium, like you were inside these water environments. I also utilized found tarps and was projecting on the tarps. So thinking about how, like we're, what we're doing with like what we build and throw away and all of our consumption and trash. And in this section here is I was working with two people who did not know how to swim, and a woman who served as like a swim instructor. I mean, she actually taught swim classes, but and she's also a bodybuilder as well. But I was interested in what it means to learn how to swim, to learn how to be in an environment that you could potentially die in, and to become comfortable in that environment. So we went. Ironically, it was not very warm in Los Angeles when I was shooting this footage. So we went to the desert hot springs in a pool where she could provide swim instruction. So the one person that we worked with could barely make it across the pool on his own, and in that day she taught him how to swim, and he was able to kind of make like the width of the pool and have more confidence in being in the water. And then another gentleman I worked with, he could kind of already do his doggy paddle, but it was I was very interested in this kind of transformation between not knowing and knowing. And this is maybe hard to tell from your view, but it's a dolphin being kind of entangled in a plastic bag. And this is actually more so in the beginning of the piece. But it gives you a little bit of sense of what the installation was about and what it was doing. And I'll show you a few installation images. It's 2 channels on one wall. And this was another iteration of kind of thinking through this material with 2 other artists, a writer, Fred Moten, who is also a cultural critic, and this musician, James Gordon Williams, who's based in Syracuse. Fred Moten's based in New York. And this was the second iteration of this project we've done called You Are Mine, Now I Have to Let You Go. And so this was kind of a live performance of me working live with video with some of the material from Aragonite Stars, and Fred and James all of us responding to each other live. So I'm going to end right there. Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Matthew Schum. I'm happy to be back in Canada. As Glen mentioned, I did my undergrad at Simon Fraser University with a bunch of radical feminist Marxists who I think set me on my way quite well in terms of going on and studying art further. So it's nice to be here. Thanks to Glen for the invitation. It's so nice to share the stage with these 2 wonderful artists. Desert X is a new biennial in the California desert. It started last year, and it was directed by a British curator named Neville Wakefield. He's been in the United States for a long time. My partner Amanda and I are now the co-curators, so we're working with Neville. We do hope you'll join us. There's lots of snowbirds in the low desert around Palm Springs from all over colder regions in North America. It's February 9th in the Coachella Valley. And just to be clear, some of the work that you'll find today on the website, it wasn't necessarily my work, but Doug Aiken was a very popular piece last year, and I think it captures the potential of site-specific art, large-scale installations out in the desert. So this is a rather rudimentary structure, just a house, and Doug Aiken put mirrors around it. If you could click the link there, we can go to the video online and just give you a little bit of a taste for how this functioned for viewers. The actual text back there is a hyperlink. Okay. Oh well. So the low desert should be distinguished from what we call the high desert. The high desert is near the low desert. The low desert is the Coachella Valley, essentially from Morongo down to the Salton Sea. We're below sea level there. There's mountains on either side. The high desert may be something you've heard of before. It's near Joshua Tree National Park. It's at about 4,000 or 5,000 feet in altitude, and it's a big plateau. What we're working with here, though, is a kind of gigantic treasure hunt of sorts, where you go from place to place, and we hope that people can traverse the exhibition in roughly a weekend. Some of these places will be very close to Palm Springs, which is the main town there, and you can see them right in the city, or some of them will require quite a bit of driving, up to an hour from civilization into the desert. So just to give you a little bit more background, the Coachella Valley is a confluence of the Cahuilla tribal lands, industrial farming, military, and most visibly in cities like Palm Springs, real estate developments driven by retirement communities and vacation homes for snowbirds and the well-to-do. So it's a very American kind of intersection in terms of interests and histories. To give you some background, the first real industry there was the date industry, and this was part of the kind of industrial reclamation of the land, and it grew from research that was done by the government and then helped to kind of create one of the largest sectors of industrial farming anywhere. So a lot of the year-round fruits and vegetables you can get in a place like Canada will be coming from this very part of California. Interestingly enough, the culture, though, is something that grew out of the date palm industry in terms of these dates being brought from the Middle East in the early 20th century. So there's kind of a mid-century Middle Eastern inspired Americana culture that's still very visible there. And this sort of aided the whole white settlement of the region and turned it into this kind of vacation paradise. So there was a residue of Orientalism that's still very evident in the Coachella Valley. These would be some early pamphlets from the Coachella Valley. And there were also things like the Riverside County Date Festival, which had a really interesting version of the Beauty Queen, which you'll find at any state fair in the United States, but it was Princess Scheherazade, or Queen Scheherazade. Here is the most recent court. For a very long time, there was absolutely no diversity in terms of the different Scheherazades that were crowned. They were almost entirely white up until the last decade. And I think they've now expanded this Queen Scheherazade to include other kinds of scholarships for the people who win the Beauty Queen contest. This is a picture I took from the actual Riverside County Fair grounds, which are there permanently, which I think says a lot about California and how this region was developed and what sort of dislocations of a global culture were at play here. This is, of course, inspired by a lot of things. I think especially Hollywood's notion of Middle Eastern culture. You even have these wonderful cinder block arabesques, which I thought were a wonderful touch. There's a series of towns in the Coachella Valley. Palm Springs is sort of the place where you have the mid-century modern architecture, you have the golf courses, and as you go down through the valley, there's different registers of the economy. Indio is one of the older towns, and it's struggling quite a bit compared to a place like Palm Springs. But there are different murals that kind of reference this older culture of the date farms. Here's a mural, and again, relying on this kind of Egyptomania sort of thing you'd get in Las Vegas and elsewhere. As a local historian wrote, visit Indio or Coachella today and you can drive down streets named Arabia, Baghdad, Deglet Nor, Medina, Damascus, Arabi, and Kamel. You can even visit a high school with an Arab mascot. So this is a picture I took years ago. The Fighting Sheikhs, I think it's called. It was also riddled with bullet holes. So this gives you a sense for the sort of different cultures that are active in the Coachella Valley. And I think the point of showing you this is that you get a sense for what sort of context you're living in there and what sort of things might be interested to artists. To take this kind of Egyptomania or this Orientalism and really boil it down to something truly American, in the 40s and 50s, they developed something called the date shake, which of course is just a vanilla shake with date crystals mixed into it. It's extremely sweet and very American, but it was a way to get you to pull over that giant Buick you were driving through the desert and get a snack. As far as the topography, you have the San Andreas Fault running right through the Coachella Valley. Various mountain ranges around, and the artists engage these different places. And one place that I've been really interested in terms of my own research out there, and actually since I moved there to do my PhD down at UCSD in San Diego and was going out to the desert a lot, is the Salton Sea. So the Salton Sea, you can see right there, is right in the middle of this desert. It's actually an ancient ocean floor. And the Salton Sea was the Salton Sink prior to the Colorado River filling this area. But I also just want to note while we're on this slide, you can see that patchwork around the Salton Sea. This is all agriculture. It's a desert lake, a salty lake that's more than 230 feet below sea level. And it's an interesting example of industry kind of gone wrong. For over 2 years, the Colorado River spilled into this part of the desert. But it's also worth knowing that this had happened naturally without any human intervention in previous centuries. It's now fed by a series of rivers. Some of them flow from Mexico into this desert valley. And the real problem here is that if this Salton Sea dries up, there's all sorts of heavy metals that are in the soil and in the dust due to the agriculture and the runoff. So though this may have happened naturally thousands of years ago, when it dried up before, there wasn't a toxic dust left over. So it's a very good example of how industrialism is changing the landscape out in the Coachella Valley. And even since I moved there for grad school about 12 years ago, the actual Salton Sea has visibly shrunk. On top of that, you have all sorts of algae blooms and fish die-offs because, of course, it was for a long time a vacation site with all sorts of sport fishing and water skiing. Another view of the area. So for years, the lake's ecosystem has settled into a steady collapse, and it's far more saltier than the ocean at this point. And the remaining fish will die, adding bacteria to the lake, and there's already a lot of children in particular struggling with respiratory illness in the region. And this is one of the trips we took. The way Desert X works is we'll bring artists out from all over the country and other countries as well. And we just show them around. So you can see here, this picture I took earlier in the year, where these bushes are in the foreground, that's where the shore of the lake used to be, and just how many meters it's shrunk. But it's also an extremely beautiful place. So you're kind of waiting for, it's this ecological disaster in the making, but then when you go there, besides the sometimes really intense smell of the lake, it's really one of the most beautiful places in the desert as well. So I think this is also a kind of very American paradigm. The what looks like sand particles is actually pulverized vertebrae of fish. So it's quite a dystopic place. It really does feel like a kind of Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome environment. This is another one of our site visits. One of the few cloudy days I've ever seen out there. But again, a very beautiful place. This is one of the first resort clubs. It's called Shadow Mountain. And Shadow Mountain is typical of the kind of Palm Desert, Palm Springs clubs you get, where it may be next to a golf course and you buy a condo and then you have access to all of these amenities. What's interesting, I think, about this particular swimming pool here is that it's rumored to have been made by bomb craters that Patton's troops made when they were training in the desert. So you have this kind of military, industrial military culture being taken over by this other real estate development culture. We're missing a word there. But it gives you a sense for the visual layers and the history in the region. I'm not sure my slides are working right, but... this is another place at the south end of the Salton Sea. It's called the Hill Marina. And again, that bridge there is where boats used to exit out of the marina after you had launched your boat. These different grooves you see in the ground is what you do for dust mitigation after a place is dried up. Famously, the Owens Lake Valley, which was part of the whole Chinatown Roman Polanski film, they do this a lot to create dust mitigation. So the desert is many ruins and therefore domains for art to make a kind of contextual relationship. And they might kind of seem merely allegorical. I guess what I mean by that is it's this idea of a ruin or an allegory for the viewer. And ruins in general, according to Walter Benjamin, confront a kind of petrified primordial landscape. It's sorrowful, untimely, unsuccessful. This kind of history laid bare. So humanity subjected to this nature is, in this case, kind of none other than the fall of this empire that we call the United States, perhaps. And it's where you kind of come to the sheer limits of another culture turning over and maybe reaching its end. And I think the real challenge as a curator then is this just a kind of wasteland culture? Is this just a place where you can go and take pictures of some place in ruins, or is there something maybe else going on besides this crazy difference between the manicured golf courses of Palm Springs, where wealthy people from around North America come and have recreation, and this wasteland culture where people who are not from a privileged background are kind of stuck with respiratory illness. Is there some other more productive space inside of that that isn't just this allegory for fallen culture? So kind of holding forth the idea of site specificity, I think the question I have as a curator is, what is sort of a more purposeful reclamation? I think Shirin Gerges, who made this particular piece for the previous Desert X, is a really great example of this. One I call is at a place called Whitewater Preserve, which is an interesting reclamation of an older reclamation. This used to be a place where they had a fish farm, and it was sort of, turned over, and they essentially made a state park, although it's privately owned. So it's this nonprofit that took over the land, and now this is the entranceway to what's called the Salton Sea, the largest national monument that Obama made right before he left office. And it goes from the desert all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And what this Whitewater Preserve does is it gives you access to that land. And then on top of it, you have Shirin Gerges coming in and making this Pigeon House, which is a site-specific sculpture, and it's based on desert villages in Egypt, which is her background. And the piece is based on this domestication of birds, and it has many references, therefore, to the very idea of migration of any kind. It's at once a beacon and a sanctuary and a memorial for the people and communities of any desert, anywhere, who kind of have experienced any kind of marginalization. It addresses contemporary concerns of cultural agency, environmental protection, and displacement that's really very much at stake in our California desert. Again, my slides aren't working. I apologize. And we would go to a video here. But in any case, this is a great example of rethinking contextualism in contemporary art, rethinking site specificity. Shirin even used the local silt to create this adobe-like structure in the desert. Thank you very much.
These just... Does this do anything? It does do something. Okay. Thank you. This is great. I love that we did kind of get so much terrain in here. And yeah, I grew up in LA, and I guess I want to sort of start with that idea of that difference between the kind of wasteland and the kind of beauty, which I don't know if all of, I think Suné's work in terms of dealing with something that is not beautiful within that or within that environment. And even we think of suburbia as being something that's not beautiful, and yet your paintings are. So I guess I'd be curious to just maybe quickly, we don't have a lot of time, but to talk about, just how that tension might affect all of what you do. And if anybody wants to take that one.
I guess I'll just, since I've been talking, I'll keep talking. I feel like the desert's interesting because there's nothing wasteland about it. That's the cliche about it. It's really just a more transparent culture. So the things, the trash, the animals, all of the things that are out there, it's a different, more kind of transparent civilization, and that can lead to more visible forms of decay.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with you in terms of like kind of the complex terrain that I guess a wasteland conjures, and I guess in my work in particular, thinking about like the desert hot springs where there's that it's such a right place for for lack of a better word, like rejuvenation. And I guess, I don't really think so much about, I guess, like the tension between beauty and wasteland, I guess, in particular in my work, but thinking about a more complex kind of understanding of what we see as kind of a nothing place or a nothingness.
So I guess in the past, I've also made a lot of work that dealt a little bit, directly with suburbia in sort of a different way. But my thought on that is just like, I'm interested in something that's about localness. And I think that sort of like bringing like a humanity to like development in California that maybe is not like, I don't know, like the most, maybe is like architecturally not very interesting or derivative or feels like tear down, which I think just generally American development has that quality. And I think just sort of a sensitivity and like being on the ground, like you mentioned, is like maybe a sort of a stance that I believe in personally in terms of making work. So I don't know if that kind of touches on.
Yeah, or this may be something that occurs everywhere, but I feel like aspects of California become much more specific. I mean, I guess for you and everybody, like, could you make, or how much has that environment shifted what you do? How much of an impact has it had on your work?
Well, I think it, I think definitely just because it's where I'm from. So I think part of my work, that I didn't show in this presentation was really a reaction to being other places and having grown up with like, sort of being used to sort of this range that is the California landscape and all its like ugliness and beauty and, so I think, in that regard, yes. And then, definitely just in terms of thinking about, light and color and like art history. And I think that all that stuff is like, whether I like it or not, or like is in, I don't know. I'm a very intuitive artist, so it's not like necessarily like I set out for that, but I think it just is like filtered through my practice. So yes, I don't think I think that grounding, whether I was working here or somewhere else now, would be in it, whether or not it was a direct subject.
Yeah. I mean, I know, again, growing up in LA, I loved Ed Ruscha because I felt like it was so reflective of this place and kind of exalting it, the idea that, all right, this is drab, flat, whatever, and yet this work just thrills me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Suné, do you feel like being in LA, which is not where you're from, but do you find your work shifted once you were there?
Yeah, for sure. I came to the West Coast from the East Coast. I was living in New York and landed in San Francisco for school, and then moved to Los Angeles. But it completely has informed how I think about my work, and also as a place. There's this idea of kind of like people of color not being welcome in outdoor spaces, and especially in relationship to the history of the American South. That there's just it's a kind of a violent history. And also, the West too, but I guess it's more documented in the American South. But so it has informed kind of I need to work outdoors. I believe, and I think that it helps me to think about like my relationship to, other species and other, like being like my kind of interconnectedness on the planet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Matthew, obviously this project is site-specific. How does that how inspiring is that landscape?
Well, it's very, very inspiring. I just think the California desert says so much about the whole American project at the moment. And I think its successes, but also its potential saving graces are all out there. It really has a lot to offer. But it's one of these places where you think you understand it, and the more time you spend out there, the more You learn from it and can take from it, whether that's at the level of civilization or at the level of nature. There's really just so many layers out there. And it's this place that really feels both overwrought with different ideas about nature or discourses about American life, and totally outside of any sort of discursive thing or location. So it's a great site to try and do something that I guess would be akin to like a critical regionalism, where there's been so much going on out there for so long that you can just sort of continue to be informed by its peculiarity, its peculiar interests, its many personalities. So it seems like one thing, but it's a million things all the time.
Okay, I know we're just about out of time. I don't know if I'm hoping there's a question out there from anybody. I know there's a lot to take in. No? All right. Well, I hope you'll all come back to hear Kota Ozawa, who's an artist who works out of California and Germany, who's next, who is a great person to listen to. And I hope you'll also look at the indoor-outdoor exhibition for the Focus California. And thanks to our guests. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.